I gave out copies. I hope you all have them. And I didn't copy the entire Sicha. The Sicha is 9 sides. That means 5 sheets. But the first and the last talk about Yecheved, which I may do in a later class, but they're not relevant for today, so I didn't copy them. I only copied pages 28 until, I guess, 33, 32, which is all you really need for today's class. This is our second class on Shmois, right? We're calling this Exile and Redemption. That's what we're calling this syllabus. Last week we learned about the fact that the Jewish people were counted and given names, and the significance of the fact that they were given names. This week we're going to talk about what happened subsequently. What's the story? The story is Yosef came to Mitzrayim, and because of how he dealt with his hardships, that's how the Rabbi explains it in the Sichos, he eventually rose to an incredible position of power. Yosef's rising to an incredible position of power is not only seen as a technical or a physical thing. Yosef's rise to a position of power is seen as a spiritual managing of Egypt. Egypt was a physical place. It was a very prosperous place. It was at that time considered very modern, very sophisticated, but it was also spiritually very unclean. It was a low place from a perspective of what Torah considers important. Yosef did not only survive in that land, he thrived in that land. He thrived to such a degree that he brought his whole family. Yosef tells his brothers, bring Yaakov Avinu to Mitzrayim. The entire family comes to Egypt. They live in Egypt in incredible prosperity. Now, the mathematics goes like this. Here's the cheshbon. This is how it works, okay? If you look in the Chumash says that Golus Mitzrayim was meant to be 400 years. In one place, it actually says 430 years. There's a controversial Even Ezra, but we'll leave that out of the discussion. The 400 years are considered to start from the birth, underlined, of Yitzchak. In other words, it's exactly 400 years between the birth of Yitzchak and the Exodus. Yitzchak was born in 2048, the Exodus happens in 2448. Now, how old was Avraham when Yitzchak was born? 100. So there's exactly 500 years from the birth of Avraham to the Exodus. Avraham was born in 1948 from creation. The Exodus happens in the year 2448. 500 years later to the day. So when Yitzchak is born, the 400 years begins, and Rashi has to account for why this is. It's very hard to understand how the birth of Yitzchak is the beginning of Golus. And Rashi says, because from when Yitzchak is born, Avraham Avinu became a wanderer. It's not the discussion for today. The bottom line is, we were not in Egypt for 400 years. It's a fact. The Even Ezra has a different perspective, like I said, but this is at least Rashi's opinion, and most Mefarshim's opinion. So, if the 400 years is the birth of Yitzchak, you got to do the math. Yitzchak is 60 when Yaakov is born. Yaakov is approximately 84. 84? Yaakov is approximately 90 or 91 when Yosef is born. So you have 60 plus 91, that's 151 when Yosef is born. Yosef is 30 when he becomes the vizier in Egypt. Okay, so give me the numbers. What are we holding now? It's 151 plus 30 is 181. 9 years later, his family joins him. That's 190 years. So what's left over of the 400? 210. And this is what we always say, the Jewish people spent in Egypt 210 years. There's actually a remez in the Chumash that Hashem says to Yaakov Avinu, Redu Shama, go down there. Yaakov says to his children, Redu Shama, descend. Redu is the gematria of 210. Reish is 200, Dalad is 4, Vav is 6, is 210. The time that the Jewish people spent in Egypt, from the moment Yaakov stepped foot into that land until his children departed, is 210 years, which is about half of 400. But that's not even the end of the story. Why not? Because the Chazal tell us that the exile did not begin in earnest until the last of the 12 sons of Yaakov passed away. The exile did not begin in earnest till the last of the 12 sons of Yaakov passed away. How do we know this? From the biblical text. It says, Vayamas Yosef, Yosef died. V'chol Echav, and all of his brothers. V'chol Adeiru, that entire generation. Uvnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, Paru, Vayishritzu, Vayirbu, Vayafim, they're multiplying and growing. And then only after the death of all of the 12 tribes does the Torah tell us, Vayaka Melech Chodesh Al Mitzrayim, Egypt gets a new king, Asher Lo Yadash Yosef, doesn't know Yosef, and that's when all the tzaras start. So we went from 400 to 210, right? But it's not even 210. You have to wait for the last of the sons of Yaakov to die. Who was the last of the sons of Yosef to die? The answer is Levi. Levi lived 136 years. How old was Levi when he came to Egypt? How old was Levi when he came to Egypt? When Levi came to Egypt, Yosef was 39. Okay, Levi was a few years older than Yosef, but only a few. Levi was not 20 years older than Yosef. He was probably 5 years older than Yosef, or 4 years older than Yosef. Because from the birth of Reuven until the birth of Yosef, which is 12 children, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehudi, Yisachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Yosef, and Dinah were born in 7 years from 4 different wives. It's 7 years. So Reuven is born the first, Levi is born the third, Yosef is born the 12th. But again, it's not from the same woman, it's from 3 or 4 different women. Consequently, the distance in years between Levi and Yosef is about 4, 5, maximum 5.5 years, maximum bordering on 6 years, can't be more. So if Yosef is 39 when Levi comes to Egypt, how old is Levi? Let's say he's 44, okay? Let's say 44, 5 years older than Yosef. Levi is 44 years old when he comes to Egypt, and he dies when he's 136. How many years between when he arrives in Egypt and he dies? 92 years. Agreed? So you have to remove from the 210, 92 more. What are you left with? 118. So now the 400-year slavery, which was reduced to 210, has to be re-reduced to 118. Now I want to say this. The Sifsei Chachomim, which is a commentary on Rashi, makes it very clear that the number of years of slavery was 116. I don't know what his cheshbon is, because I don't understand how it's possible for Levi to have been 7 years older than Yosef. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's his mathematics, that the goal is 116 years. So 400 becomes 210, 210 becomes 116. Okay? We're not finished. When Levi dies, the Jewish people are free and prosperous. How do you think they made them into slaves? Not overnight. There were too many Jews, right? There was a whole game that was played where the Pharaoh builds these ambitious projects and asks the Jewish people to volunteer to participate in the government, in the infrastructure of the country. And initially everybody works side by side. Over the course of time, the Jewish people are put into a subordinate role and the Jews are put into a superior role. That takes 30 more years. So if the slavery doesn't begin till 160 years before the Exodus, and it takes 30 years to fully implement the slavery, how many years are Jewish people actually slaves for? So 116 has to be reduced by 30, was 86. Now what is the significance of this? Miriam was born 86 years before the Exodus. And her name is Miriam because the root of that word is mar, bitter. Because her birth initiates the real severe Golus. Let's talk this over, okay? 400 becomes 210. 210 becomes 116. And 116 becomes 86. So, when the Eibishter said to Avraham, the Jews are going to be enslaved for 400 years, there's something gradual about that. The severe slavery is 86 years. And like I told you, I think last week, that in my fantasy, in my imagination, when I think of those 86 years, I mamish visualize 86 years of Auschwitz. That's how terrible Mitzrayim was. How Jews kept on having babies is completely supernatural. They were treated like the Nazis treated the Jews in the labor camps. They used to use their babies to fill in missed quotas of bricks. If a person didn't meet his quota, they took his child and filled him in and put mud, that was a brick. The slavery was unbelievable, but it wasn't 400 years. It was 86 years. Yitzchak's birth is one level of slavery. The descent of the family to Egypt, 190 years later, is a second level of slavery. The death of Yosef and his brothers, which according to the Sifsei Chachamim is 116 years before the Exodus, is a third level of slavery. 30 years later, when Miriam is born, is the fourth and most severe level of slavery. It lasts for 86 years. That's 17 times as long as World War II. And the Exodus occurs. You didn't go out of Mitzrayim. In the Chumash, this is described as a double exile. The Chumash describes the exile happening twice. I gave you an exile happening 4 times. The Chumash describes the exile happening twice. The first time the exile happens is when Yaakov comes to Egypt. Yaakov Avinu is living in the Holy Land. His son is the vizier. He's the vice king of Egypt, which makes him in effect the vice king of the whole world. And he asks his father to come to Mitzrayim. And he agrees. He does. He acquiesces. And when you read the story, it's such a beautiful story. It's such a nice, it's like a fairy tale. When we were little kids, but if you knew what was going to happen on the next page, where are you going, Yaakov? Why? Stay where you are. So your brother's the king of Egypt, your son is the king of Egypt. So what? He can send you a check every month, you'll live on a pension. Why do you want to move to Mitzrayim? Doesn't make any sense. What's the teretz? Why does Yaakov move to Mitzrayim? Not because Yosef tells him to, because God does. And the Eibush doesn't lie to Yaakov Avinu. He tells him the truth. This descent is the beginning of the exile. He says to Yaakov Avinu, go into Mitzrayim. Don't be afraid, because you're going to get out. He doesn't say, go to Mitzrayim because it's going to be good. He says, go to Mitzrayim because you're going to get out. He doesn't lie to Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu knows exactly what's going to happen. But Yaakov Avinu is fortunate enough to die before any of it happens. Yaakov has the best of his years in Mitzrayim. The tzaras start after he passes away, and more significantly after his children pass away. So according to Chazal, the first event of Golus is when Yaakov comes to Mitzrayim. Okay? The second event of Golus is when the brothers die. Now that makes sense, right? The second event of Golus starts when the brothers die. Why does that make sense? Because soon as the brothers died, Havan's Chakmulei begins. The last of the brothers dies. 116 years before the Exodus, as soon as the last of the brothers died, that's when the Golus starts. The scheme, the plan of enslaving the Jews begins immediately. It takes 30 years to fully implement. But the day Levi dies, Pare calls a meeting and says, okay, we got to do something about this. There's too many of them. They're too powerful, they're too rich, and so forth. So there's 2 events of Golus. The first event of Golus when Yaakov comes to Egypt. The second event of Golus when the brothers die. Are we clear? Yeah? Good. So there's a medrash which sheds a problem with this. Page 28. And as you know, what we do around here is we read only what I underlined, and I don't have enough time. So I'm going to have to skip some of what I underlined. I thought I would have more time, but I don't. So I'm reading from the right side of page 28. This is a quote from Medrash. Ve'ele shmeis b'nei Yisrael laboyim Mitzrayim. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. It says, Doch yomim rabim hayu lahem shabo Mitzrayim. When the Sefer Shmois begins, the Jews had already been in Egypt for many, many years. So what is the meaning of this statement? The Jewish people came to Egypt, says the Medrash the following. Nor, Kol Zman She Yosef Hayakayim. So long as Yosef was alive. Lo Yahaya Lahem, they did not have Masui. The meaning of Masui means the weight and heaviness. Shel Mitzrayim, of Egypt. Meis Yosef, when Yosef dies, Nasnu Aleya Masui, it put on them a burden. Lefichach, accordingly, Ksiv Haboyim, when Yosef dies, it's described as though they arrived in Egypt, Ki'ilu Oisai Hayoim Nichnesu LeMitzrayim, as if that day they arrived in Egypt. What's the question? Levi lived 136 years. How many years did Yosef live? 110. So even if we're going to say that Levi was 6 years older than Yosef, between the death of Yosef and the death of Levi is 20 whole years. Now when does the Golus start in earnest? When does the Golus start in earnest? When Levi dies. So how come the Medrash says when Yosef dies? He's the one who lived the longest. He had the greatest longevity. So how, just a question. We know that the Golus Mitzrayim is defined on two dates, right? The 400 we're not talking about. We talk about 210 and 116. 210 is when Yaakov comes to Mitzrayim, 116 is when Levi dies. Yosef died 20 years earlier. Here is a Medrash which puts a wrench into all of this. Why does this Medrash describe the onset of the Golus with the death of Yosef? Why does he not describe the onset of the Golus? As the Pasuk says, Vayomas Yosef, V'chol Echav, V'chol Adeihu, Yosef dies, his brothers die, the whole generation dies. That's when the Golus begins. This Medrash creates a problem for us. You understand? I want to tell you a story. It's parenthetical, but it's not parenthetical. Rashi actually brings it in our Parsha. This week, by the way, it happens to be Parsha Shmos. If you know the history of the Jewish people, you see patterns that are really, really striking. One of the most obvious patterns of recent Jewish history that I've seen historians mention it, but not nearly enough, is Chassidus had a golden age. Chassidus had a golden age. Chassidus once numbered millions of Chassidim. Millions of real Chassidim. What is the date for the end of the golden age of Chassidus? I'm going to tell you the answer. I'm not going to hold this against you. 1865 is the end of the golden age. 1865, that's over 150 years ago. 1865 is the end of the golden age of Chassidus. After that, the anti-Semitism grew substantially, and also the Reform made inroads into Eastern Europe, and the Jewish religious community began to come apart. Before then, they were all frum, millions and millions of Eastern European Jews in Russia and in Poland and in Hungary and of course Galicia were devout Chassidim, millions and millions of Chassidim. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, passed away in 1866. A whole generation of Rebbes died exactly at the same time. A whole generation. The Belzerov and the Kotzker Rebbe, all the holy Hasidic Rebbes passed away within a year or two of each other. It's mamish clearly divine. It's not one or two or three, it's like a dozen. And you see clearly the outer world, inner world aligned. So here's the story. The Tzemach Tzedek's successor, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, was succeeded by the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was called the Rebbe Marash, Reb Shmuel. In the months before the Tzemach Tzedek passed, he would call in his son, the Rebbe Marash, to his room, and he would open up a medrash, and he would read, Vayomas Yosef v'chol echav v'chol adeihu. Yosef died, and his brothers died, and the whole generation died with him. So the medrash says, Afal pi shemesu elu elikeim shalelu leimeis. Though these people all died, the God of these people didn't. So the Tzemach Tzedek would call in the Rebbe Marash, his son, who he was leaving a whole new world, and he would read the pasuk and the medrash. Even though the golden age is about to end and we're beginning a very, very difficult period in Jewish history, God is still alive. So the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek would call in his son. He would read him the pasuk and the medrash, and the Rebbe Marash would smile. He'd go to the other room and sob like a baby. A couple of weeks later, his father would call him again and open up the medrash and read it to him. Vayomas Yosef v'chol echav v'chol adeihu afal pi shemesu elu elikeim shleilu leimeisa. And the Marash would laugh, and they'd go into the other room. A whole winter this went on. Tzemach Tzedek passed right before Pesach. The story is very poignant, and if you could imagine Levi's death, I don't know what the Jewish people perceived what was going to be, but Levi certainly had a good idea that when he dies, something is going to change radically. But when Levi dies, not when Yosef dies. Yosef dies a full 20 years before Levi. Why does the Medrash associate the onset of a new stage of Golus with the death of Yosef? That's the question that Rebbe has in the Sikh. And the answer that the Rebbe gives is that although it wouldn't change actually until Levi dies, when Yosef died, there was already the beginning of those events. That's what the Sikh is about. And with the limited time that I have, I just want to give you a skimming of this. So we have to go very, very quickly. I want you to go to page 29. The Vav, page 29, the bottom of the first column, the Vav. Is there beer and then? The explanation is as follows. On a physical level, nothing changes between the death of Yosef and the death of Levi, no question about it. But on a spiritual level, on a mystical level, what would show itself in the death of Levi begins as soon as Yosef dies. Here's the Rebbe's explanation. The inyan from Mitzrayim, the idea of Egypt, is as the gitnit kein art fargili yelakus was lamayla meyater. The land of Egypt gives no space for godliness which is above nature. Do you know that in this Sikha, the Rebbe mentions a very famous Dvar Torah? What was the difference between making a living in Egypt and making a living in Israel? In Egypt, food came by looking down. It never rains in Egypt. They lived from what I like to call the river the Nile. The Jordan River is a very, very, very unpredictable source of irrigation. Israel lives on mountains. Now, what does mountains have to do with Parnasa? Because mountains, right? What's the answer? You all are educated. Mountains hold clouds, and clouds produce rain. So the physical topography of Egypt made it a pagan land. How do you live? Look down. The physical topography of the land of Israel makes it, how do you live? You look up. The difference between the river the Nile and living from rain is that rain is seasonal. Every year different. The Nile has been producing its bounty for thousands of years, basically uninterrupted. So when you have a source of life which is constant, you don't have to pray. It's always there. When you have a source of life which is a variable, which changes from season to season, you have to pray. So Eretz Yisrael's land made you beholden to God. Egypt's land made you beholden to nothing other than to nature. That's the physical nature of the land. And spiritually, it was that way as well. And that's what the Rebbe says. In Egypt, all you see is nature. Was der Far, top of the second column, page 29. Therefore, hat Yosef gesagt zu Pari Melech Mitzrayim Elikim. When Yosef HaTzadik talks to the Pharaoh about God, what does he call him? Elikim. Why Elikim? Because Elikim is the gematria of 86. I'll save you the torture. Okay, remember the number 86 from about 20 minutes ago? Elikim, Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem is 86. 86 also happens to have the numerical equivalently of Hat Teva. The Hebrew word for nature is the same as the Hebrew word for Elikim. Yosef talks to the Pharaoh, he says Elikim. Because Yosef understands that if he tells the Pharaoh, Havaya, Yud Ke Vavke, which means the God of the supernatural, the Pharaoh is going to say, what? There's no such God. In fact, if you go a little further, Bishas Moshe Rabbeinu is gekumen zu Pare. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Jewish Redeemer. And he comes to the Pharaoh, und ihm gesagt, Koyamar Hashem. He says, so says God. And Pare says, which God? Hashem. If he says Elikim, the Pharaoh knows that God, the God of nature he's very familiar with. But Moshe says, Koyamar Hashem. He says, what kind of God is this? He says, the God of the supernatural. The Pharaoh says, no such thing. There's no such thing as supernatural. Everything's natural. Because the Pharaoh represented the exile, the containment, the tzimtzum, the limitation of nature. Okay? So the Rebbe says, page 31, please. The mitvet menay verstehen. Again, I apologize for not having sufficient time to do this as well as I would have liked. This explains der Tam favas Yaakov. The reason why Yaakov, kumende kein Mitzrayim, when he came to Egypt, hat gegeben Parei Abracha, he gave the Pharaoh a blessing, sheyala nilas beragli. Jacob comes to the Pharaoh and he gives him a bracha. What happens after that blessing? The Pharaoh would go down to the Nile and the water would rise. A nes. So what did Parei do? Huh? Yaakov Avinu gave Parei a bracha, he comes to the river, the Nile, the water rises. What did Parei do? Yaakov Avinu gives Parei a bracha. When he comes to the river, the waters would rise. What should he have done? He should have said, thank God. What did he do instead? He said, I'm God. Correct? But when did the Pharaoh have the boldness, the guts to say that? When Yaakov was dead. He couldn't say that when Yaakov was alive. Because Yaakov gave him that bracha. So the Rebbe says he couldn't say it when Yosef was alive either. Because Yosef represented Yaakov. So they got a bracha, and the bracha was to insert into Egypt the supernatural, that the Egyptians should acknowledge that there's a force which is higher than nature, which they were witnessing. The Pharaoh goes down to the river, the waters rise. So what did he say? I'm a god. I never used the bathroom. Like we're going to have in next week's Pasha and the Pasha after. But he could only do that once Yaakov passed away, and Yosef, he didn't have to wait for Levi to die. For this was not Yosef died, because Yosef represented Yaakov. The brothers didn't. So let's read the next paragraph. There being in them, the explanation is, Adarabba, to the contrary, he said, this is the very point. Mitzrayim hadagdedin tzumnilas. Egyptians worshipped the river the Nile. Their father said, as Elo mashkas ha'aretz, because of the annual flood that used to happen in Egypt that would irrigate the land. Had Yaakov the river gebenched pare, sheyal and nilus beragle. When Yaakov Avinu gave the blessing to the Pharaoh that he could literally bring the waters up by going down to the river, was meder bracha, the intent of Yaakov in this blessing was, hat abgeschwacht die Avodah Zarah von Nilus. He wanted to diminish the idol worship, the idol that is the river the Nile, the idea that nature is the only thing that governs our lives, was altered with this bracha. The Nilus did its thing before Yaakov came there. The Nilus did its thing way after Yaakov Avinu died. Yaakov made a change. The change was that a miracle would happen. His point of making that miracle would happen is, don't be a spall from Teva. There's higher than Teva. V'haraya, the Pharaoh goes down to the water, the rivers rise. Why? Because of Yaakov Avinu. Because of Hashem. Was mider beracha hat abgeschwagt die Avodah Zarah von Nilus. The intent was to diminish the power of the worship of nature, which was represented by the river the Nile, because it came from Yaakov Avinu, came from Kadosh Baruch. Next column, page 31, left column, Siftes. Al pi zevet men verstehen. Says, but this is the answer. Vi la'acharei misas Yosef hat sich angeheubt manaya yerida. That this medrash sees the second exile beginning not with the death of Levi, which is 116 years before the Exodus, but with the death of Yosef, which is 136 years before the Exodus. Why? Because although actually nothing changed till Levi died, but spiritually the change began as soon as Yosef died. Turn to page 33. 32, pardon me. The revelation of light that Yaakov Avinu brought to Egypt, as euch dort, that even in Egypt, soll sich anhören der Shlita Memshala von der Mebishn. You should hear the dominance, the rule of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Rebbe, Tzitzich continued, calls man Chaya Yaakov, as long as Yaakov lived, or no Chaya Yosef, as long as Yosef lived. Because Yosef was the embodiment of Yaakov Avinu. He was the embodiment of Yaakov Avinu because he was as holy as Yaakov Avinu. He was as connected to Hashem as Yaakov Avinu. And therefore, says the Rebbe, as soon as Yosef dies, is there Gili Nifsa geworden. The waters continue to rise. But the acknowledgement that the waters are rising because of the Eibush to stop right then. Egypt went back to what Egypt was. A land where people worship nature. Therefore, Zog der Medrash, this Medrash says, Meis Yosef, the day Yosef dies, it was as though that was the day they came to Egypt. Even though you would see no actual change in the relationship between the Egyptians and the Jews for 20 more years until Levi dies, but the spiritual effect that would allow that with the death of Levi, the Jews could be enslaved started the moment Yosef dies. Because the slavery was a physical evolution that came from a spiritual evolution. Egypt went back to being what it was before Yaakov came. Before Yaakov came, Egypt was land that worshipped nature. After Yaakov and Yosef died, Egypt land that worships nature. And instead of the rising river being an acknowledgement of God, the rising river becomes acknowledgement of the Pharaoh. So, everybody knows that there's two stages to the Egyptian exile. Number one, 210 years before the departure. Number two, 216 years before the departure. Here's a medrash that gives us an earlier date. Not 116, but 136. Why? Because even though nothing actually changed till Levi died, spiritually it changed the moment Yosef dies. And that's what this medrash is saying. Or therefore, Zog der medrash, this medrash says, Meis Yosef, as soon as Yosef dies, all of this changes. That's the day they came into Egypt. Bizdan, so long as Yosef was alive. So long as in Egypt there was a light. Was es nimshach geworden durch Yaakov and Yosef, that Jacob and Yosef brought to Egypt, is es noch nicht gewend Ramitas in Mitzrayim. Egypt was not being Egypt. Davke when Meis Yosef, only when Yosef dies, does all of this begin. And by the way, the Rebbe has another interesting little nuance. The lashon of the Medrash is not when Yosef dies, the tzoros of Golus begins. The weight of Egypt, that's all he says. Masay Mitzrayim, the weight of Egypt. When Yosef was alive, Egypt was not heavy. In other words, just like in the Holy Land, you're close to God. In Egypt, under the inspiration of Yaakov and Yosef, Egypt wasn't heavy. Yosef dies, nothing changes actually, but all of a sudden faith is difficult. Hashem is hard to access. You're much more contained by nature. So although the actual exile doesn't begin till Levi dies, spiritually exile begins as soon as Yosef passes away.